Everyone knows Loki, the trickster god who could deceive anyone, even the gods themselves. But Loki wasn't the first, not even Hermes. Long before the Norse ever told his story, before gods threw lightning, before legends were carved into stone and thunder, there was a spider, small, eight-legged, seemingly insignificant. He had no armies, no temples, no divine throne written in the stars, and yet somehow he took something no god, no king, no force in existence had ever given up willingly. He took every story, every myth, every legend, every word ever whispered in the dark, and the terrifying part, no one could stop him. His name was Anansi, and if you think you understand what a trickster god is, you don't, not yet. Because this isn't the story you've been told. This isn't a folktale for children sitting around a fire, listening to their grandmother's voice go soft and slow. This is something older, something darker, something that survived the death of empires, the silence of forgotten languages, and the crushing weight of history trying and failing to erase it. Anansi is not a character. He is a force. And the moment you understand what he actually did, not the sanitized version, not the watered-down retelling, the moment you see the full scope of what one small spider accomplished against a god who controlled all of existence, you will never look at power the same way again. So pay attention, because what we're about to walk through changes everything. Let's start with what no one tells you. Before Anansi stole the stories, before the great bargain, before the impossible price, before the moment the sky cracked open and something shifted in the fabric of the world, there was a time when no one on Earth had any stories at all. Think about what that means. Not just no entertainment, not just no myths. No memory, no identity, no way to make sense of suffering, no framework for love or loss or war or why the sun rose and fell without explanation. Human beings existed in a kind of fog, alive, breathing, feeling, but without the language of meaning to hold any of it together. Stories are not decoration, they are the architecture of the human mind. And every single one of them belonged to someone else. His name was Niam, the sky god, the supreme deity of the Akan people of West Africa, one of the oldest, most sophisticated civilizations the world has ever produced. The Akan were not a simple people telling simple stories. Their cosmology was vast and intricate. Their understanding of the divine was layered, complex, philosophical. And at the top of it all sat Niam, the one who breathed the world into existence, the one who held dominion over all things seen and unseen. And Niam kept the stories. All of them. Locked away in a great golden box in the sky, sealed with a power no mortal and no lesser deity could touch. Why? Because Niam understood something that everyone else had missed. Whoever controls the stories, controls reality itself, controls how people see themselves, controls what they believe is possible, controls the boundaries of imagination. Stories were the most dangerous thing in existence. So Niam held them, and the world below was silent, alive, but hollow, full of people who experienced things they could not name, who suffered things they could not explain, who died without understanding why. That silence was Niam's power, and he had no intention of breaking it. Until a spider came knocking. Now here is the first thing you need to understand about Anansi, the thing that separates him from every other trickster figure in the entire global mythology canon. Loki tricked gods because he was bored, because he was restless, because there was something broken and chaotic inside him that he could never quite contain. Anansi tricked gods because he had a plan. Not impulse, not mischief, not divine madness. A cold, calculated, audacious plan, constructed with the precision of someone who had already thought 17 moves ahead before anyone else had taken their first step. When Anansi climbed to the sky to stand before Niam, he didn't beg, he didn't threaten, he didn't perform, he simply made an offer. He said, "I want to buy the stories." And Niam laughed. Not a warm laugh, not an amused laugh, the kind of laugh that shakes the clouds, the kind of laugh that says, "You are so far beneath me that your audacity is almost entertaining." Because who was Anansi to make this request? A spider, a small creature, a being of the earth, not the sky. He had nothing, no army at his back, no divine lineage to invoke, no wealth, no territory, no leverage of any kind. And Niamh knew this. Which is exactly why what Niamh said next was not a refusal. It was a trap. Niamh smiled, and God's smiling is never a good sign, and he named his price. He said, if you want the stories, bring me 3 things. Bring me Onini the python, the great serpent whose length has never been measured, whose power has never been matched, whose scales have crushed rivers dry. Bring me Osibo the leopard, the shadow that moves without sound, the death that waits in tall grass, the beast that has never been caught. And bring me Moboro the hornets, not one hornet, not a nest of hornets, every hornet, the swarm itself. Bring me these 3 things, and the stories are yours. The court of heaven went silent. Because everyone there understood what Niamh had just done. He hadn't given Anansi a task. He had given him a death sentence dressed up as a challenge. Onini the python alone would have destroyed armies. Osibo the leopard was a force of pure, untamed violence. And the hornets were not just dangerous. They were legendary, a swarm that had driven entire villages mad, that had caused men to throw themselves into rivers just to escape the pain. This was not a price, it was a dismissal. Niamh expected Anansi to bow his head and crawl back to the earth. He expected the spider to understand, quietly and permanently, that some things are simply beyond your reach. But Anansi did not bow. He said, I will bring you what you have asked for. And he walked away. The court of heaven exchanged glances, because there's a specific kind of dread that sets in when someone who should be afraid isn't, when someone who should retreat advances, when the math of the situation says impossible, but the person in front of you acts as though the math is wrong. That dread, that was the first sign. No one was paying close enough attention. Now watch what happens next, because this is where the story stops being a folktale and starts being a masterclass. Anansi went back to the earth. He did not panic, he did not grieve, he did not sit with the weight of impossibility and let it crush him. He thought. He walked into the forest with nothing but his mind, and he started weaving, not webs, not traps, not snares. He started weaving stories before anyone else had any. He found Onini the python stretched along the bank of a great river, enormous and still, basking in a power so ancient it predated thought. And Anansi approached not with a weapon, not with a cage, not with force of any kind. He approached with a conversation. He said, I have been having an argument with my wife. The python, who found humans generally beneath notice, was, against his better judgment, curious. Anansi continued, she claims that you are not as long as this palm tree lying here on the ground. I said, of course you are, you must be, but she won't believe me, and the only way to settle it is to measure. The python looked at the fallen palm tree. He looked at Anansi. This was so beneath him, so transparently a non-threat, so harmless. He agreed. He stretched himself alongside the palm tree, and Anansi, very helpfully, very respectfully, began to tie the python to the tree with bark fiber, just to keep him straight for the measurement, just to make sure the result was accurate, just to be thorough. The first length of fiber, then the second, then the third. And by the time Onini, the python, realized what was happening, by the time the wrongness of the situation had traveled from the surface of his scales down into his ancient, calculating mind, it was already done. He was bound. And Anansi had not raised a hand in violence, had not fought, had not threatened, had used only the thing Niamh had kept locked away, the architecture of a story, a conflict, 2 characters, a question that needed answering, a narrative so familiar, so disarming, so profoundly human that even a godlike serpent had walked straight into the middle of it without realizing he'd entered a trap. 1 down. But here is where you need to stop and feel the weight of what just happened, because Anansi had just done something that should have been impossible. He'd captured the most powerful serpent in existence using nothing but words and the shape of a story. And if you think that was the hard one, you're not ready for what comes next. Osibo the leopard. If Onini was power, Osibo was violence. Where the python was ancient and patient, the leopard was immediate and lethal. There was no measuring Osibo, no conversation that would distract him long enough. He was death itself, wearing spotted fur, and he knew it. Anansi did not approach Osibo directly. He went to where Osibo walked at night, and he dug a pit. A deep pit covered with leaves and branches, precisely where the leopard's path would take him in the darkness. And when Osibo fell, when that enormous, lethal body crashed into the earth and found itself looking up at walls it could not climb, Anansi appeared at the edge, looking down. And Osibo, furious, demanded to be helped out. This is the moment. This is where every other version of this story rushes past something profound. Anansi said, "I will help you, but you must let me tie you just so I can pull you up safely, just so you don't fall again on the way out." And Osibo, pride screaming, instinct overriding reason, agreed, because being helped out of a pit, even bound, was better than the alternative. Anansi tied him, pulled him just far enough out of the pit, and then carried him, bound and furious, to the sky. 2 down. Naim's court was no longer laughing. Something had shifted in the air up there, a kind of atmospheric unease, the feeling you get when the story you thought you were telling is suddenly telling you something different. The impossible task was becoming less impossible with every passing moment, and no one in that court had a framework for what that meant. But Mobaro was still out there. The hornets. And if the python required patience and the leopard required cunning, the hornets required something else entirely. They required a kind of audacity that bordered on insanity. Because you cannot trap a swarm. You cannot negotiate with 10,000 stings. You cannot dig a pit for something that moves in every direction at once. Anansi went to the tree where the hornets lived, a tree that pulsed and hummed with a violence so constant it had become its own kind of silence, and he stood before it in the rain. Or rather, he created the illusion of rain, poured water over himself, poured water over the tree, and called out to the hornets. He said, "Can you not see it is raining? Are you foolish enough to stay outside in a storm this heavy? I have a gourd, climb inside, stay dry, wait for it to pass." And the hornets, because the story Anansi was telling was so immediate, so practical, so grounded in the simple logic of shelter and survival, began to fly into the gourd. First dozens, then hundreds, then all of them. Every last one. Anansi sealed the gourd and carried it to the sky. Now stop, because we have arrived at the moment that changes everything. And if you are the kind of person who believes that stories are just stories, that mythology is decoration, that legends are entertainment, what happens next will rearrange something in the way you see the world. Anansi stood before Naim with a bound python, a bound leopard, and a sealed gourd full of hornets. He had done the impossible, all 3 tasks, every single one. And Naim, the supreme deity, the sky god, the being who had laughed, went silent. A long, terrible silence. And then Naim spoke, and what he said was not congratulations, it was not simply, "Well done, the stories are yours." What Naim said was something that has echoed through every telling of this myth for thousands of years, something that historians and scholars and storytellers have returned to again and again because of how much it contains. He said, "Great kings and warriors have come to me before, and they could not do what you have done. You, Anansi, you have done it. The stories of the sky god are now and forever the stories of Anansi." And in that moment, in that singular, world-altering moment, something broke. Not physically, not violently, but structurally. The architecture of divine power had a crack running through it. Because Naim had believed, as all-powerful beings believe, that the price he had set was safely beyond reach, that the gap between what he held and what anyone else could obtain was so vast as to be permanent. He had not set an impossible task. He had set what he believed was an impossible task, and the difference between those two things is the difference between a locked door and a door that simply looks locked. Anansi had found the difference. And now every story in existence belonged to a spider. But here, right here, is where the real story begins. Because what does it mean that Anansi now owned the stories? What does it mean for a trickster god to hold every myth, every legend, every word ever spoken in the dark? It means he controls what people believe is possible. It means he controls how they understand suffering and joy and war and love and death. It means he holds in his eight-legged hands the single most dangerous thing in existence, the power to shape reality through narrative. And Naim, the sky god, had handed it over. Willingly. Through a deal he had made because he was certain he could never lose it. Think about the terror of that. Think about what it says about the nature of power, that the most powerful being in a cosmology could be outmaneuvered not by greater power, not by armies or weapons or divine force, but by intelligence, by patience, by the ability to construct a story so convincing that even your enemy walks into it voluntarily. This is what separates Anansi from every other trickster god in human mythology. Loki uses chaos, Anansi uses narrative. Loki breaks things, Anansi builds traps that look like gifts. Loki is feared, Anansi is underestimated. And underestimation, as we have now seen, is the most dangerous weapon in the world, because it makes your enemy comfortable, it makes them confident, it makes them name their price without ever imagining you could pay it. But the story, God help us, the story does not end here. Because Anansi now had the stories, all of them, and the question that no one in heaven or earth had stopped to ask, the question that would prove to be the second crack in the foundation of the world, was this. What would Anansi do with them? Would he keep them locked away, as Naim had? Would he build his own golden box in his corner of the world and sit upon the stories the same way the sky god had, hoarding them, using their absence as power, keeping humanity in that hollow fog? He could have. That would have been the rational move, the strategic move, the move that maximized power and minimized risk. Anansi did not make that move. He released the stories. He let them go, let them scatter into the wind like silk threads from his web, carried by breath and memory and voice from village to village, generation to generation, culture to culture. He did not keep them. He did not sell them. He did not even guard them. He gave them away. And here is the twist that nobody talks about, the revelation buried inside the mythology that changes the entire moral of the story. By releasing the stories, Anansi did something far more permanent than keeping them would have allowed, because a story held in a golden box can be reclaimed, can be seized, can be lost, but a story living in the mouths and minds of millions of people, a story woven into the identity of entire civilizations, that cannot be taken back. Anansi understood that the only way to truly own something is to make it impossible to ever be taken from you. And the only way to make a story impossible to take is to release it into the world so completely that it becomes part of the world itself. He didn't just buy the stories. He made the stories permanent. And Naim, watching from the sky, finally understood, finally saw the full depth of what had happened, not just the tasks, not just the price, but the entire architecture of what Anansi had built from the very moment he climbed to the sky to make his offer. He had not just bought the stories. He had made himself eternal. Because as long as there were stories, as long as human beings sat in firelight and opened their mouths and said, "Let me tell you something," Anansi would live, not in a temple, not on a throne, not in a golden box. In every story, in every teller, in every word. And the terror of that, the true bone-deep terror, is not that Anansi outmaneuvered a god. It is that the god never had a chance. From the moment Anansi decided he wanted the stories, the outcome was already written. Every step Naim took was a step Anansi had already accounted for. The laughter in the court of heaven, accounted for. The impossible price, accounted for. The confidence of divine power, accounted for. Anansi had built a web. Not of silk, not of fiber. Of inevitability. And Naim, for all his thunder and his sky and his golden box, had walked into it smiling. But there is one more thing, one final layer. Because the stories Anansi released into the world were not neutral. They were not blank pages for humanity to fill in however they chose. Every single one of them, every myth, every legend, every warning and wonder ever whispered in the dark, carried something inside it. They carried Anansi himself. Not his face, not his name always, but his signature. The way a spider leaves a thread so fine you cannot see it until the light hits just right, that is how Anansi threaded himself into every story in existence. A small twist, a slight subversion, a moment where the powerful become vulnerable and the small become unstoppable, a moment where cleverness defeats strength, where patience defeats force, where a question asked at the right moment can undo what armies could not. Every story that has ever made you feel like the underdog could win, that is Anansi. Every myth that ever told you strength is not the only form of power, that is Anansi. Every legend that ever whispered, the one they are not watching is the one who will change everything, that is Anansi. He is not in the stories. He is the shape the stories take. And that is why even now, even after everything, even in a world that has forgotten his name in most of the places it was once spoken, the stories he released still carry his signature, still hold his pattern, still whisper in the space between words that the spider was here, that the spider is still here, that the spider never left. Anansi survived the silence that tried to swallow his people's memory. He survived the erasure that tried to bury his name. He survived the centuries that crushed cultures larger and louder than his. He survived because he had already done the one thing that makes a being truly unkillable. He had become the stories themselves. And stories do not die. They travel, they change shape. They move from mouth to mind to page to screen, picking up new languages and losing old ones, wearing different faces in different lands. The spider who walked the forests of West Africa became Anansi in the Caribbean, Aunt Nancy in the American South, a ghost story in a place that had never heard of the Akan people, and still, somehow, the shape of him survived. The pattern, the signature, the slight subversion that says, the small one is not finished yet. You want to know why that matters? Because Naim was enormous. Naim was a sky god. Naim controlled all of existence. And no one tells his stories the way they tell Anansi's. Think about that. The god who held everything, who laughed from the heights of the sky at a spider with no army and no throne, and the thing that has endured, the thing that traveled farthest. The thing that settled deepest into the human mind was not the sky god's power. It was the spider's cleverness. It was the web. It was the story of how the small looked up at the vast and said, I will find a way, and then did. And if you have been here since the beginning, if you have traveled all the way from that first impossible moment when a spider climbed toward the sky with nothing but a plan, then you already understand something that most people never quite articulate. The most dangerous being in any world is not the one with the most power. It is the one with the most patience. The one who waits, who watches, who weaves, who asks the right question at the right moment and listens, really listens, to what the answer reveals about where the trap should go. Anansi did not defeat Naim. He outlasted him. And that is the thing that keeps the spider alive long after the thunder goes quiet. Because thunderstorms end. But a web built carefully, built patiently, built with full knowledge of where every thread must go. A web endures. Anansi was here before the first story was ever told. And if you listen, if you really listen to the space between every myth you have ever heard, he is still weaving.